The colony world of Tessara 4 was burning, not with fire, but with light. Bright flashes of plasma and energy weapons lit up the sky like a violent storm, turning the peaceful purple twilight into something ugly and terrifying. Below, in tunnels carved deep into the soft earth, thousands of Pelthari huddled together in the dark. They were small creatures, barely reaching the waist of a human, with thin bodies covered in smooth plates that shimmered like beetle shells. Their large, dark eyes were built for reading star charts and studying the patterns of the universe. They were not built for war. Ambassador Levon pressed her 4 delicate fingers against the communication panel and sent the signal again. The emergency frequency of the Galactic Concord. The alliance they had joined 3 generations ago. The alliance that had promised them protection. "This is Ambassador Levon of the Pelthari colony Tessara 4, she said, her voice shaking but clear. "We are under attack by the Vithari Dominion. Our orbital defenses are failing. Civilian casualties are rising. We are requesting immediate military assistance. Please, respond." Silence. The same silence she had heard for the last 9 hours. Above the planet, Commander Rothi watched another one of his ships break apart. The Pelthari defense vessels were small and fast, designed for exploration and scientific survey. They had light shields and lighter weapons. Against the Vithari warships, they were like glass bottles thrown against stone walls. "Commander," one of his officers said quietly, "we have lost 7 of our 12 ships. The remaining 5 cannot hold orbit for more than 2 hours. Rothi closed his large eyes for a moment. He had trained his entire life for a moment like this, but nothing in his training had prepared him for the simple truth that they could not win. The Vithari were too many and too strong. Their ships were built for one purpose only, and they were very good at that purpose. "Keep the formation tight around the civilian transports," Rothi ordered. "Buy them time to evacuate." "Evacuate to where, Commander? They have blockaded every exit vector." Rothi did not answer. He had no answer to give. On the surface, Levon sent the signal one more time. Her assistant, a young Pelthari named Fenny, stood beside her with tears running down his face. Around them, hundreds of civilians sat in the tunnels, holding their children close. The ground shook every few minutes as orbital strikes hit the surface above. "Why are they not answering?" Fenny whispered. Levon shook her head. She knew why. The Galactic Concord was a large and powerful alliance, but it moved slowly. Everything required discussion, debate, votes, and approval. By the time they decided to act, Tessara 4 would be ash. What Levon did not know was that her signal had traveled further than she intended. The Concord's emergency frequency was tightly controlled, but the colony's damaged communication array had sent the signal bleeding out into unregulated deep space channels. It scattered across frequencies that no Concord species monitored, into the dark and silent reaches of space where only one kind of species operated. The kind that the Galactic Concord had classified under a single entry in every database across 1,000 worlds. A simple warning, with no further explanation needed. Deathworld origin, do not engage. 14 light-years away, the signal reached the bridge of the Terran warship Iron Horizon. Admiral Kang Do-hyun was drinking coffee when the communication officer flagged the transmission. He was a tall man with broad shoulders and a face that looked like it had been carved from stone, and then softened slightly by age. His hair was cut short and streaked with gray. He had served in the Terran fleet for 31 years, and had seen enough of the galaxy to know that most of it wanted nothing to do with humanity. "Admiral," the communication officer said, "we are picking up a repeating distress signal on a non-standard frequency. It matches the format of a Galactic Concord emergency broadcast." Kang raised an eyebrow. "The Concord does not broadcast to us." "No, sir. It appears to be signal bleed from a damaged array. The source is a colony world designated Tessera 4. They are reporting a military attack by something called the Vethari Dominion. Kang set down his coffee and walked to the main display. The signal played through the bridge speakers, even through the static and the alien language that the translation software converted into flat, emotionless words. He could hear it. The fear, the desperation, the sound of someone calling into the dark and praying that something would call back. He looked around the bridge. His crew looked back at him. They were young, most of them. Lieutenant No Taesum sat at the tactical station, barely 26 years old, watching Kang with sharp, steady eyes. At the helm, Navigation Officer Park Sumi waited with her hands ready on the controls. "Do we know these people?" Kang asked. "No, sir," the communication officer replied. "The Pelthari are a minor Concord species. We have no treaties, no contact history, no obligations." "Do we know the attackers?" "The Vethari Dominion, reptilian species, expansionist military empire. They conquer smaller worlds for resources and territory." Kang was quiet for a long moment. Tessera 4 was not far. At maximum speed, they could be there in under 6 hours. But it was not their fight. No one had asked them to come. No one would thank them. The Concord would probably be angry, and the Vethari had, by all estimates, at least 40 warships in that system. He had 12. "Sir," Taesung said from the tactical station. Kang looked at the young lieutenant. "What is it?" "Respectfully, sir, are we going?" The admiral stared at the display for another moment. Then he picked up his coffee and took a long sip. "Someone out there is screaming for help," he said simply. "That is enough for me. Navigation, set course for Tessera 4, maximum speed. All hands to battle stations." The bridge erupted into motion. Alarms rang. Lights shifted to combat red. Across the 12 ships of the 7th Deep Space Response Fleet, crews ran to their positions, sealed their armor, and powered up weapons that had been built on a world where survival was never guaranteed, and helping your neighbor was the only reason anyone survived at all. Far away, on Tessera 4, Ambassador Levon stared at her scanner with exhausted eyes. The Concord channel was still silent, but something else appeared at the edge of the system. A new fleet signature. Unknown. 12 ships, moving fast, moving with a kind of aggressive purpose that made the scanner flicker with warning signs. "Fenny," Levon whispered, her voice barely audible over the shaking ground. "Something is coming." Fenny looked at the scanner. "Are they Concord?" "No," Levon said. "I do not know what they are." The ships were getting closer, fast, and they were not slowing down. The Vethari Dominion fleet hung in orbit above Tessera 4 like a ring of iron teeth. 40 warships, each one long and sharp, and covered in dark plating that absorbed light instead of reflecting it. Their commander, Warlord Drenax, stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Burning Fang, and watched the last Pelthari defense ships struggling to hold formation. He felt nothing but boredom. This was not a battle. This was a harvest. The Pelthari were weak and soft, and their world was rich with minerals and water. The Dominion needed both. The math was simple. It always was. "Warlord," his sensor officer called out. "New contacts entering the system. 12 vessels. Unknown configuration." Drenax turned his heavy-scaled head. His eyes were yellow with vertical slits, and they narrowed as he studied the display. 12 ships had dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the system and were accelerating toward the planet at a speed that should not have been possible for ships their size. "Identify them," Drenax ordered. "Attempting, Warlord. They do not match any known Concord fleet design. Their hull composition is unusual, extremely dense metallic alloys. Energy signatures are irregular and aggressive." "How aggressive?" The sensor officer hesitated. Their reactors are running at what appears to be combat output, Warlord. All 12 of them. They came out of FTL already prepared to fight. Drenax studied the incoming fleet. The ships were not beautiful. Concorde vessels were elegant and smooth, designed as much for appearance as for function. These new ships looked like they had been built by creatures who did not care about beauty. They were thick and heavy, covered in layered armor plating and studded with weapons. They looked like fists made of metal. 12 ships, Drenax said, and a low rumble of laughter rolled through his chest. Against 40. Open a channel. Before he could speak, a signal cut through every frequency in the system. A wideband broadcast, powerful enough to reach every ship in orbit, every station on the surface, and every emergency receiver on the planet below. A voice spoke, female, calm, hard as iron. This is Captain Yoon Hana of the Terran vessel Baiko. You are firing on civilians. You have 60 seconds to power down your weapons and withdraw from this system. There will not be a second warning. Silence followed. On the Pelthari command ship, Commander Rothi stared at his communication panel as if it had grown teeth. On the surface, Ambassador Levan listened to the translation and felt something she had not felt in hours. Hope, maybe. Or perhaps just confusion. Drenax blinked slowly. The bridge crew of the Burning Fang laughed with him. Terran, he said, tasting the word. I do not know this species. 40 ships against 12, and they demand my withdrawal? He leaned forward. Open a response channel. Tell this captain that I will add her ships to the debris field around this world. On the bridge of the Baiko, Captain Yoon Hana listened to the Vethari response and nodded once, as if she had expected nothing different. She was a woman of average height, with sharp eyes and black hair pulled back tight. There was a scar along her jaw from a training accident years ago. She never had it removed. She said it reminded her that mistakes had consequences. Lieutenant No, she said, how are we looking? On the iron horizon, linked by tactical communication, Lieutenant No Taesung ran the numbers. 40 Vethari warships, 12 human vessels. The Vethari ships were larger, but built for a galaxy where most species fought at long range with energy weapons, maintaining safe distances and predictable formations. They had never fought a species from a world where the weather alone could kill you before breakfast. The odds are not great, Captain, Taesung said with a slight smile that did not match his words. But their formation is wide. They are used to fighting enemies who keep their distance. If we go in close and fast, we can break their lines before they adjust. Admiral Kang Do-hyun listened from the command chair of the Iron Horizon. His face was calm. He had fought in worse situations. Not many, but enough to know that numbers were not everything. All ships, Kang said, his voice steady and quiet, the kind of voice that made people listen, not because it was loud, but because it was certain. Weapons free. The 7th Fleet surged forward. What happened next would be studied by every military academy in the galaxy for the next 100 years. The human ships did not form neat lines. They did not advance in orderly rows. They split into groups of 3 and 4, moving at different speeds and angles, weaving through the gaps in the Vethari formation like wolves cutting through a herd. The Baiko led the charge. Captain Yoon Hana drove her destroyer straight into the center of the Vethari fleet, so close that the enemy ships could not use their long-range weapons without hitting each other. At that range, the humans switched to kinetic weapons, solid rounds of hardened metal, accelerated to terrible speeds, punching through Vethari armor like needles through cloth. The Vethari fired back. Their plasma cannons hit the human ships, and the bridges of those ships shook, and sparks flew, and damage alarms screamed. They were built from the heavy metals of Earth, forged in the deep gravity of a world that crushed weakness out of everything it produced. Where a Concorde ship would have cracked and broken, the human ships dented, burned, and kept coming. On the Pelthari command ship, Commander Rothi watched the battle unfold on his display. His 4 hands gripped the edge of his console so tightly that his joints ached. "They are insane," he whispered. The Baco rolled between 2 Vethari cruisers, firing port and starboard at the same time, then accelerated out the other side, before either cruiser could turn to follow. Behind her, the cruisers fired at each other by accident. 5 Vethari ships were destroyed in the first 10 minutes of the engagement. 2 more were crippled. The human fleet had taken damage, heavy damage on some ships, but not a single one had fallen out of formation. On the burning Fang, Drenax was no longer laughing. He watched the tactical display as his perfect formation collapsed into chaos. These small, dense, ugly ships were inside his lines now, too close to hit cleanly, moving too fast to track. And every time his gunners thought they had a target locked, the target was already somewhere else. "What are these creatures?" he growled. His intelligence officer pulled up the only entry in the galactic database. A single line of text, repeated in every language the Concord used. Deathworld origin. Classification, extreme. Do not engage. Drenax stared at those words. For the first time in a very long career of conquest and violence, he felt something cold settle into his chest. Not fear exactly, but doubt. The kind of doubt that comes when a predator realizes it is no longer the most dangerous thing in the room. Far below, on the surface of Tessara 4, Ambassador Levon watched the battle through the colony's damaged telescope array. She saw the human ships dancing through fire, saw them take hits that would have destroyed her own vessels and simply keep fighting, saw them move with a coordination that was not mechanical but alive, like a pack of hunting animals working together by instinct. She turned to Fenny, who stood beside her with his mouth open. "I do not know what they are," Levon said softly, "but I think they came to help us." Above them, the battle raged on, and the wolves were winning. The battle above Tessara 4 had turned into a grinding, vicious thing. The initial shock of the human attack had faded, and Warlord Drenax had pulled his remaining ships into a tighter formation, using their numbers to absorb the damage, while his gunners adapted to the humans' unpredictable movements. The Vethari were not stupid. They were cruel and aggressive, but they had conquered dozens of worlds for a reason. They learned fast. Admiral Kang Do-hyun watched the tactical display from the bridge of the Iron Horizon and saw the problem clearly. The Vethari were adjusting, and worse, Drenax had sent a signal to a nearby staging ground. Reinforcements were coming. 20 more warships, less than 3 hours away. "We cannot win a war of numbers," Kang said to his bridge crew. "We need to change the shape of this fight." But that was a problem for orbit. On the ground, there was a more immediate crisis. Vethari landing ships had broken through during the chaos of the battle and dropped troops on the surface. 200 Vethari soldiers, heavily armed, were marching toward the underground shelters, where thousands of Pelthari civilians were hiding. Commander Rothi's ground defenders were trying to hold them, but the Pelthari were small and fragile. Their weapons were designed for hunting animals, not fighting soldiers. The Vethari pushed through them like a river through sand. "Admiral," Captain Yoon Hana's voice came through the tactical link. "The ground situation is critical. If those shelters fall, this was all for nothing." Kang nodded. "Sergeant Bay, are your people ready?" In the drop bay of the Iron Horizon, Sergeant Bay Jian checked her rifle one more time and looked at her squad. 8 soldiers, each one born on a world with gravity strong enough to crush a Pelthari flat, raised on food chains where humans were not at the top, trained in conditions that most galactic species would consider torture. Jian was 32 years old. She had short hair, steady hands, and eyes that had seen too much and still stayed open. She had survived 3 campaigns on worlds that the galaxy called death traps. She did not talk much, but when she did, people listened. "We drop hot," she told her squad. "Atmosphere will be rough. Gravity on the surface is about 40% of Earth's standard. You will feel light. Do not let that make you careless. The enemy is real, even if the gravity is not. We find the civilians, we hold the line, we keep them alive. Clear?" "Clear, Sergeant." The drop pods launched, 8 metal capsules, each one carrying a single human soldier, punched through the atmosphere of Tessara 4 like bullets. The sky above the colony lit up with streaks of orange and white as the pods burned through the air. The Pelthari on the surface looked up and saw what appeared to be falling stars heading straight for the battlefield. Jian's pod hit the ground, hard enough to crack the earth around it. The hatch blew open, and she stepped out into a world that felt like a dream. The gravity was so light that every step wanted to become a jump. The air was thin and sweet, filled with the smell of burning metal and alien flowers. Around her, her squad was emerging from their own pods, adjusting to the strange lightness of this world. They moved fast toward the shelters. The Pelthari defenders saw them first. A group of Pelthari soldiers, if they could be called that, crouched behind a collapsed wall, firing small energy weapons at the advancing Vathari line. When they saw the humans approaching, they froze. Jian was almost twice the height of the tallest Pelthari. In the low gravity, she moved with long, powerful strides that covered ground at a speed the Pelthari could not match, even at a full run. Her armor was dark and scarred. Her rifle was the size of a Pelthari child. "Friendly," Jian said, holding up one hand. "We are here to help." The Pelthari stared at her with their huge dark eyes. One of them raised a shaking hand and pointed down the corridor toward the shelter entrance. "The enemy is that way. Many of them. We cannot stop them." "We can," Jian said simply. "Stay behind us." Her squad moved into the corridors of the colony, and the fighting began. The Vathari ground troops were large, armored, and well-trained. Each one stood nearly as tall as a human, with thick scaled skin and claws that could tear through metal. They fought with plasma rifles and brute force, and against the Pelthari, they had been unstoppable. Against the humans, they lasted about 4 minutes. Jian's squad cleared the first corridor with brutal efficiency. The humans moved like they had been born fighting in hallways. They used the low gravity to their advantage, leaping over barricades, changing positions faster than the Vathari could track, firing with a precision that came from training on a world where missing your shot meant something with teeth would eat you. The Vathari fell back. Then they regrouped and pushed forward again. And the humans pushed them back again. It became a grinding rhythm, attack and defense, advance and retreat. And each time the humans held the line a little more firmly. Deep in the shelters, Dr. Shin Unji arrived with the second wave of drops. She was not a soldier. She was a doctor and a xenobiologist, and she had volunteered for this mission because she knew that bullets alone would not save these people. Someone needed to keep them alive long enough for the battle to end. She found the main shelter filled with over 1,000 Pelthari civilians. They were huddled in groups, the adults forming circles around the children, trembling with every shake of the ground above. When Unji walked in, the room went silent. Every pair of dark eyes turned to look at her. She was enormous by their standards, a towering figure in a white medical coat stained with dust, carrying a bag full of equipment they had never seen. She could see their fear. They did not know what she was. They only knew she was from a death world, and everything they had ever been told about death worlds said that nothing good came from them. Unji knelt down. She made herself small, or as small as a human could be in a room full of beings half her size. She moved slowly, kept her hands visible, and spoke in a soft, calm voice that the translation device carried across the room. "My name is Shin Unji," she said. "I am a doctor. I am here to help. Is anyone injured? Silence. Then a small Pelthari child, barely the size of a human toddler, stepped forward from behind its parent. It had a burn on its arm, the shell plates cracked and weeping. It looked up at Unji with eyes full of pain and confusion. Unji opened her medical bag, took out a healing gel designed for carbon-based species, and gently, so gently, applied it to the child's arm. The child flinched at first, then relaxed as the pain faded. It looked at its arm, then looked up at Unji, and made a small sound that the translator rendered as, "Thank you." The room breathed. Something shifted. The fear did not disappear, but it changed shape. These Deathworlders were terrifying, yes. They were massive and dense, and came from a world of nightmares. But this one was kneeling on the floor, treating a child's wound with hands that could crush stone, but chose to heal instead. Meanwhile, far above in orbit, Lieutenant No Tae-sung stared at his tactical display and had an idea. A terrible, brilliant, completely insane idea. "Admiral," he said, "the colony had a network of mining satellites in orbit before the attack. They were disabled but not destroyed. If we could reactivate them and reprogram their drilling lasers and mass drivers, we could turn them into kinetic bombardment platforms." Kang looked at him. "You want to drop rocks on their reinforcement fleet?" "Tungsten rods, sir. Accelerated to orbital velocity. The Vithari will exit FTL in a predictable entry corridor. If we position the satellites along that corridor—" "It is insane, Lieutenant." Tae-sung nodded. "Yes, sir." Kang almost smiled. "Do it." Far away, in the grand chamber of the Galactic Concord, High Arbiter Soneth finally received the full report of the Tessera 4 situation. He read it twice. He convened a committee. The committee requested more information. They began to discuss. On Tessera 4, Sergeant Bae Ji-yeon stood in the main corridor leading to the civilian shelter. 30 Vithari soldiers were charging down the hall toward her. Behind her were 1,000 civilians who had no one else. She planted her feet, raised her rifle, and said one thing: "You do not get past me." The Vithari reinforcement fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel exactly where Lieutenant No Tae-sung said they would. 20 warships, fresh and fully armed, emerging into real space in a standard entry corridor that every Vithari fleet had used for 100 years. They had never had a reason to change it. No one had ever been crazy enough to mine a FTL exit point. Humans, it turned out, were exactly that crazy. The reprogrammed mining satellites fired. Not lasers, not plasma, tungsten rods. Simple, heavy, solid pieces of metal, accelerated to speeds that turned them into something more destructive than any energy weapon in the Concorde's entire arsenal. They hit the Vithari reinforcement fleet before the ships had even finished powering up their shields. 3 cruisers were gutted in the first 2 seconds. The tungsten rods punched through their hulls like needles through paper, tearing through decks, reactors, and crew compartments without slowing down. 2 more ships took crippling hits, spinning out of formation with their engines dead. The remaining 15 scattered in panic, breaking their clean entry formation into a mess of confused, angry ships trying to figure out what had just hit them. On the iron horizon, Tae-sung allowed himself a small, quiet breath of satisfaction. It was not a smile. It was something deeper than that. The satisfaction of a mind that had seen a problem and found an answer that no one else in the galaxy would have thought of, because no one else in the galaxy thought like a human. "Satellites are spent, Admiral," he reported. "One-time use. But the reinforcement fleet has lost 5 ships, and their formation is broken." "Good work, Lieutenant," Admiral Kang Do-hyun said. His voice was calm, but there was warmth in it. Then his expression hardened. "Now we finish this." But Warlord Drenax had other plans. Enraged by the destruction of his reinforcements, humiliated by the chaos that 12 small ships had caused in his perfect war, he made a decision driven by fury instead of logic. He ordered every remaining ship in his original fleet to concentrate fire on the Iron Horizon. Kill the human commander. Cut the head off the snake. 30 Vethari warships turned their guns on a single target. The Iron Horizon shook like a toy in the hands of an angry child. The bridge was filled with sparks, smoke, and the screaming of metal under stress. Consoles exploded. Crew members were thrown from their seats. The main lights went out, and the emergency lighting turned everything a deep bloody red. Kang was thrown against his command console. He felt something crack in his ribs. Blood ran from a cut above his eye, warm and blinding. Around him, his crew was picking themselves up, getting back to their stations, doing what humans had always done when the world was falling apart around them. They kept going. "Damage report," Kang said through gritted teeth. "Forward shields at 12%. Hull breaches on decks 3 through 7. Engine 2 is offline. Weapon systems are at 60% capacity." Kang gripped the edge of his console and pulled himself upright. His ribs screamed. He ignored them. "We hold position. We do not run." Across the tactical link, Captain Yoon Hana heard the damage reports from the Iron Horizon and made her own decision without waiting for orders. She turned the Baiko and drove it directly into the gap between the Iron Horizon and the Vethari fleet, placing her ship in the line of fire. "All ships, this is Captain Yoon," she broadcast to the fleet. "Form on the Baiko. We shield the flagship. We hold the line." The human fleet responded instantly, not because of orders or protocols, but because of something older and deeper. The same instinct that had made their ancestors stand shoulder to shoulder against predators on the plains of Earth. The understanding that you protect your own, and right now, every ship in this fleet was family. The Baiko took hit after hit. Her armor buckled and burned. But she held, and behind her, the Iron Horizon's engineers worked with desperate speed to bring the shields back online. On the surface of Tessara 4, the ground battle had reached its most desperate moment. Sergeant Beijian's squad had held the shelter entrance for over 2 hours, but they were running low on ammunition and energy. The Vethari kept coming, wave after wave, and each wave pushed a little closer. But something unexpected happened. A group of Pelthari civilians emerged from the shelter behind Jian's squad. They were carrying weapons. Vethari weapons picked up from fallen soldiers. Their thin arms shook with the weight of the guns. Their large eyes were wide with fear. But they stood. A Pelthari elder, barely reaching Jian's hip, stepped forward and said in a trembling voice, "You are fighting for our children. We will fight beside you." Jian looked at them. These small, fragile, terrified people who had never held a weapon in their lives, standing up because someone had shown them that standing up was possible. She nodded once, a gesture of respect that crossed every species boundary. "Stay behind the barricade," she told them. "Fire when I fire. Stop when I stop. We do this together." The next Vethari wave broke against a line that was no longer just human. It was human and Pelthari, fighting side by side. The giants and the small ones, the Deathworlders and the Garden-Worlders, holding the door together. Deep in the shelter, Dr. Shin Unji had not stopped working for a single moment. She moved between the wounded, human and Pelthari alike, treating burns and fractures and shock with hands that never shook. A Pelthari elder sat nearby and watched her work with quiet attention. "You are from a world of death," the elder said, "yet you heal." Unji paused for just a moment. She looked at the elder with tired eyes and said, "That is exactly why we heal. We know what death costs, better than most." The elder was silent for a long time after that. In orbit, the battle reached its climax. Drenax threw everything he had at the human fleet, but the humans would not break. They bent, they bled, they burned. And then Hana did something that no sane commander in the galaxy would have done. She accelerated the Baiko to full speed and aimed it directly at the burning Fang, Drenax's flagship. "Captain Yoon, what are you doing?" Kang's voice came through the tactical link, sharp with alarm. "Ending this, Admiral." The Baiko hit the burning Fang at close range, not with weapons, but with its own hull. The impact locked the two ships together, metal grinding against metal, shields flaring and dying as the two vessels became one tangled mass. It was brutal. It was primitive. It was the most human thing anyone in the galaxy had ever seen. "Boarding parties, go," Hana ordered. Human soldiers in heavy armor poured through the breach points where the two ships had fused together. They stormed onto the Vethari flagship with rifles and fury, fighting through corridors designed for species that had never imagined anyone would be insane enough to board a warship in the middle of a battle. The Vethari crew fought back. They were strong and fierce, but they had never faced a Deathworlder in close quarters. The humans were faster, tougher, and driven by something the Vethari did not understand. Not hatred, not bloodlust, something worse from the Vethari perspective. Purpose. It took 11 minutes to reach the bridge. Hana was the first through the door. She was bleeding from a wound on her shoulder, her armor was scorched and dented, and her eyes were burning with a fire that had nothing to do with anger. Drenax stood at his command console, surrounded by the last of his bridge guards. He was massive, taller than any human, covered in thick scales, and armed with claws that could tear through steel. He looked at this small, bleeding, stubborn creature that had rammed her own ship into his, and walked through his corridors to face him, and he could not understand. "Why?" he asked, his voice low and rumbling. "These insects are nothing to you. You share no blood, no treaty, no history. Why did you come?" Hana looked at him with steady eyes. Blood dripped from her fingers onto the deck. "Because they asked," she said. The bridge guards dropped their weapons. Something in Hana's voice, in her eyes, in the simple certainty of those 3 words, broke something inside them that claws and plasma could not have touched. The Vethari fleet received the signal that their warlord had been captured. Without their commander, without their reinforcements, with their formation shattered and their confidence destroyed, they did the only thing left to do. They ran. One by one, then in groups, the Vethari warships broke orbit and fled into FTL, scattering in every direction like animals running from a fire. The skies above Tessara 4 went quiet for the first time in days. On the surface, the last Vethari ground troops surrendered. Jien lowered her rifle and sat down on the ground for the first time in 12 hours. Around her, Palthari civilians emerged from the shelters, blinking in the sunlight, looking up at the sky where battered human ships held orbit like watchful guardians. A Palthari child walked up to Jien and placed a small flower in her hand. Jien looked at it, then at the child, and for the first time in a very long time, she smiled. The Galactic Concord diplomatic envoy arrived at Tessara 4, 3 days after the last Vethari ship fled the system. 3 elegant vessels, painted in the silver and blue of the Concord, slid into orbit above a world they had expected to find conquered, burned, and silent. Instead, they found something that made no sense at all. The colony was alive, damaged, scarred, and still smoldering in places, but alive. And moving among the ruins were figures that should not have been there. Tall, dense, heavy-boned creatures, working alongside the small Palthari, lifting beams that no Palthari could move, welding metal with tools that hissed and sparked, carrying crates of supplies from shuttles that bore no Concord markings. High Arbiter Soneth descended to the surface in a private shuttle. He was a Calvari, a species that resembled tall, thin birds, with long necks and feathers that shifted color with their mood. His feathers were currently a troubled shade of gray. He had held his position for 20 years and had built his career on careful diplomacy, measured responses, and the firm belief that the galaxy was best managed through patience and process. He had not expected this. He walked through the colony with his guard and his advisors, and everywhere he looked, he saw humans. Human engineers were helping Pelthari technicians rebuild the shield generators. Human medics were running a field hospital near the main shelter, treating Pelthari wounded with equipment that was crude by Concord standards, but effective. Human soldiers sat in the dust outside the shelters, sharing food from their ration packs with Pelthari children, who climbed over them like they were playground equipment. Soneth found Admiral Kang Do-hyun standing near the colony's central square, watching the reconstruction with his arms folded. The Admiral's ribs were wrapped in bandages beneath his uniform. The cut above his eye had been sealed, but would leave a scar. He looked tired and calm, the way a man looks after he has done something hard and knows he would do it again. "Admiral Kang," Soneth said, his voice formal and careful. "I am High Arbiter Soneth of the Galactic Concord. I must say, this is not what I expected to find." "What did you expect?" Kang asked. Soneth paused. "A Vethari conquest, a lost world, perhaps survivors in need of evacuation." "Then you expected to arrive too late." The words were simple, but they hit Soneth like a slap. His feathers flickered to a deep, embarrassed blue before he controlled them. He straightened his long neck and tried to regain his composure. "The Concord operates through established channels," he said. "The emergency was assessed, committees were convened, a response was authorized through proper procedure. These things take time." They had hours, not time. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. 3 days ago, there were 1,000 children in those shelters, listening to the ceiling crack above them, wondering if the next explosion would be the last thing they ever heard. They did not need a committee. They needed someone to show up. Soneth had no response to that. He stood in the dusty square of a colony that should have been dead, and looked at the humans who had kept it alive, and for the first time in his long career, he felt the weight of every hour his process had wasted. He tried a different approach. "You must understand, Admiral, the Concord has maintained a policy regarding Deathworld species for centuries. Your kind are classified as extremely dangerous. Contact has been deliberately limited. The risks were considered too great." Kang looked at him for a long moment. "You were afraid of us. We were cautious, and while you were being afraid, people were dying." Kang turned back to the square. "I am not here to argue politics, Arbiter. I am here because someone sent a signal into the dark, and we were the ones who heard it. That is all." Across the colony, the work continued. Captain Yoon Hana was standing near the damaged shield generator, arguing loudly with a Pelthari engineer about the best way to reroute power from the backup grid. The Pelthari was half her size and twice as stubborn, and the argument had been going on for an hour. Neither of them seemed to want to stop. It was, in its own strange way, a sign that things were getting back to normal. Lieutenant No Taesung sat cross-legged on the ground near the field hospital, showing a group of Pelthari technicians how the human targeting systems worked. They were fascinated. Every few minutes, one of them would ask a question that made him think about something he had never considered before, and he would nod slowly and say, "That is actually a very good point." Sergeant Bae Jeon was in the open area outside the shelters, surrounded by a crowd of Pelthari children. She was teaching them a simple clapping game, the kind that human children played on school playgrounds. The Pelthari children had 4 hands, which made the game significantly more complicated, and Jeon was losing badly. She did not seem to mind. Dr. Shin Eunji was inside the field hospital, sharing her medical notes with a group of Pelthari healers. She explained human medicine in simple terms, and they explained Pelthari biology in return. She listened with the focused attention of someone who understood that knowledge shared was knowledge doubled. Ambassador Levon found Soneth standing alone near his shuttle, watching the colony with an expression that her translator could not fully read, but that she understood anyway. It was the expression of someone who had been proven wrong and was still deciding how to feel about it. "High Arbiter," she said, "I wish to formally request that the Pelthari be permitted to establish direct diplomatic relations with the Terran Federation, outside the standard Concord channels." Sonet's feathers went sharp with surprise. "Ambassador, that would be highly irregular. The Concord exists precisely to manage interspecies relations. Going outside our framework could set a dangerous precedent." Levon looked at him. She was small, even by Pelthari standards, and she had spent her entire career being polite and careful and following every rule the Concord had set for her. But she had also spent 3 days watching humans bleed for her people, hold corridors against impossible odds for her people, kneel on dusty floors to heal her people's children. She had watched a woman ram her own ship into a warship to capture the enemy commander. She had watched a sergeant stand in a hallway and refuse to move while 30 soldiers tried to kill her. "Arbiter Soneth," she said, and her voice was steady and clear, and carried more weight than anything she had ever said before. "You arrived 3 days late with words. They arrived in hours with warships. I know who I trust with the survival of my people. You may file your objections through your committees." She turned and walked away. Soneth watched her go and said nothing. In the days that followed, word of the Battle of Tessara IV spread across the galaxy like fire through dry grass. The story was told and retold on 1,000 worlds in 1,000 languages. The details changed with each telling, but the core remained the same. A small, peaceful species had been attacked. They had called for help. Their allies had debated, but the Deathworlders had come. Other species began to take notice. Small, vulnerable civilizations that lived on the edges of dangerous space. Species that the Concord had promised to protect, but that had always wondered what would happen when the promise was tested. Quietly, through back channels and unofficial communications, they began reaching out to the Terran Federation. Not for treaties or trade agreements, just to say hello. Just to know that someone was there. The humans, once shunned as monsters from a death world, became something no one had expected. Not conquerors, not saviors, something simpler and more powerful than either. They became the ones you called when no one else would come. Deep in Vathari Dominion space, far from the broken fleet and the captured warlord and the humiliation of Tessara IV, a military intelligence office reviewed the battle footage. Senior officers watched in silence as 12 human ships dismantled a fleet 3 times their size. They watched a sergeant hold a corridor. They watched a captain ram her ship into a flagship. They watched a doctor kneel to treat an alien child with hands built for a gravity that would flatten most species in the galaxy. A Vathari general, old and scarred and wise enough to know when the game had changed, closed the file. He sat in silence for a long time. Then he issued a single order to every fleet commander in the Dominion. Update the territorial expansion maps. All systems bordering Deathworlder space are hereby classified as no conquest zones. Effective immediately. No exceptions. His aide looked at him with confusion. "General, we have never retreated from an expansion corridor before." The general looked at the frozen image on his screen. Captain Yoon Hana, standing on the bridge of a captured flagship, bleeding and unbroken, staring into the recording device with eyes that held no hatred, no cruelty, and no mercy. "We are not retreating," the general said quietly. "We are being smart." On Tessara IV, the reconstruction continued. The human fleet remained in orbit, battered and scarred, but still there, still watching, still standing guard over a world that was not theirs, but that they had chosen to protect anyway. Ambassador Levon stood on the surface of her colony and looked up at those ships, and felt something that no amount of Concord diplomacy had ever given her. Safety. Real, solid, undeniable safety. Not the kind written in treaties and debated in councils. The kind that bled for you and asked for nothing in return. Across the galaxy, in the quiet spaces between stars, a new saying began to spread. It was whispered first by the Pelthari, then picked up by the traders and travelers who passed through their system, then carried to 100 worlds and 1,000 species who had spent their entire existence feeling small and afraid in a universe full of things bigger and stronger than them. The saying was simple. It did not need to be complicated. If you are lost, if you are broken, if no one is coming, send your signal wide and pray the Deathworlders hear it. Because they will come. They always come.